start with this. Hey, this is Warren Redlick. Thank you for watching. I'm here with Emmet Peppers and Ed Stevenson. We're going to talk about SonderPods and how the housing crisis and how SonderPods and other ideas can make life better for people, provide housing in places where it's hard to find housing. I guess I'll start with you, Emmet. Emmet, you suggested we have this conversation. What motivated you to talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, full disclosure, I've known Ed for, I don't know, since I moved to California, pretty much 6 or 7 years now. And he now is headquartered in New Zealand, actually moved there. But he started a company called SonderPods, which I had invested in initially. And it's actually doing quite, in my view, it's doing quite well as an early, stage company that is building ADUs. I think it's addressable dwelling units. Is that right, Ed? Is that
associated dwelling units?
Accessory
dwelling units.
Accessory dwelling. Both close.
ADUs, whatever that means. Yeah.
And
it's a big market in California. It's for more affordable housing. And I've been able to see the whole journey with Ed, or a lot of it. He keeps me informed, and I've been, I saw one of their units up in person, and it was much better than I thought. And he's gone over a lot of, I've learned a lot from him, from what he's done. He's told me about all the struggles and obstacles. And then you see companies like Boxabl and other company startups. And, I just see a lot of flaws in other companies, but, you had expressed interest in it, Warren. So I tried to throw out the idea of SonderPods, or what your idea is. And then we suggested we have a chat about it.
Yeah, I think this is great. So, and just to be clear, accessory dwelling units, I think the idea is you already have a home and you have space in your backyard for an additional dwelling. And there's some special California law that's basically very encouraging to add these accessory dwelling units to an existing dwelling. Can you explain that?
Sure. Yeah. So really there's accessory dwelling units can come in a number of forms. You could be just converting a room into a sort of fully self-contained apartment within your house, like converting a garage or something like that. Or you could do what we specialize in, which is actually create a new standalone dwelling in your backyard. And you're right, there's been a number of laws passed in California, which similar laws are actually being passed all over the country to make it easier and easier as states and cities see infill housing or accessory dwelling units as one of the big answers to the affordable housing crisis. So in short, what the legislation says is that if you've got enough room, and what they mean by room is that if you're allowing for enough room from boundaries or from the primary house to make sure it's not a fire hazard and things like that, then the local cities cannot overrule anyone from building an accessory dwelling unit in their home. So it's a significant change in legislation where the times of yesteryear would be almost impossible to get these things permitted. It's actually a very straightforward and streamlined process now.
Yeah, I've had a lot of conversations with people about this topic because I have my own idea we'll talk about later. And it seems like the real hurdle to providing more housing is actually the governments get in the way. Local governments in particular make it difficult to build what you want to build. I own an acre of land that I want to build on, but there's a minimum dwelling size of 750 square feet. And I would be perfectly happy with, say, a 250 or 300 square foot dwelling, because it's just like a little cabin for me, my zombie apocalypse getaway, right? I don't need a 750 square foot dwelling. And, in order to meet the zoning code, I would either have to get some sort of variance, and who knows whether I'd get it or not, or I have to build something much larger than I really need. And so what are the rules here? You mentioned California. You said other states are also looking at this. Where else have you seen progress on this?
So Oregon, Washington State, there's certainly some, the use very similar laws. And then, on the East Coast, we're starting to see this a bit more as well. I think there are a lot of states that are looking at California, seeing how it's working out, and then the stuff that makes sense that they're looking to adopt that as well. So mainly on the coast so far. I think anywhere where you're seeing, very high cost per square foot, building of housing, I think that's where it makes a lot of sense, where there's those high density areas.
I'm glad you mentioned cost per square foot, because I'll put this up on the video when I edit, but I looked in, like, say you have 3 models on your website. You have SP430, SP540, and SP750. And when I look at the full cost of a roughly 400 square foot accessory dwelling unit, it ends up being about $200,000, which if I'm not mistaken is around $500 a square foot. Mm-hmm. And I'm in Florida where brand new high-end luxury homes are like $300 a square foot. Maybe they're up a little higher now because of the rise, but I don't think they're to $400 a square foot yet. And that's for like that's including land, the $300 to $400 a square foot. Yours doesn't even include the land. So why is it still so expensive, even when you're not paying for land and you don't have then the permitting is easier?
Well, I think a big part of it, obviously, it's one of the big mysteries where if you if you go into some of the central states and so forth, like for example, like Omaha, Nebraska, and so forth, you can get a 4-bedroom home for $250,000, and the equivalent home in California would cost you well above $1 million. So I think that the cost of housing goes right throughout the supply chain, and it does vary greatly state to state. So therefore, the cost of materials, the cost of labor, the cost of all of the other associated services that you need to actually make a home, moving from factory to actually having a move-in ready home, is that all of those costs are different right across the state. So we tend to look at it as far as based on the equivalent of what it would cost you to take a traditional method of building in California, that we typically find that we're 20 to 40% cheaper than what you would typically see in California. Now, the difference between 20 to 40, even within California, like if you're around Bakersfield or something like that, you're still seeing lower property values. So therefore, maybe we're only a fraction cheaper than other options there. But say, for example, if you're in other areas like Orange County or a lot around the Bay Area and so forth, then you're going to see a much more efficient and lower price point versus some of the options that you've got there.
That's actually my fear. Like when I think about the housing problem, I think the housing problem is pretty widespread. And when I look at what you're doing, and I look at Boxabl, I've interviewed the Galliano from Boxabl as well.
Yeah,
it seems like when you add the pricing up, it gets so expensive that the solution is really more of a California solution. It's a solution in places with really high cost of living. This approach would not really work in places where housing isn't as expensive.
Well, I think, as I know that you're a big fan of Tesla and you follow Tesla a lot, right? As far as
a little bit.
A little bit. So, starting with, one of the things that they did was that they started with the Model S, right? Because, that was a higher price point and they needed to build technologies and capabilities to then be able to come out with the 3 and the Y and everything else from that, right? So we've learned a hell of a lot over the last 2 to 3 years about looking at absolutely every step of the process, not only from construction, because construction in a factory is actually such a small part of the puzzle. It's about actually transportation of these things, meeting local codes. Say, for example, California is very stringent Title 24 net zero energy requirements and these sorts of things. You need to check all of these boxes. And what we've identified are huge amounts of inefficiencies right throughout that entire process, whether it's, someone that's doing a simple site survey and charging people $3,000 for a site survey. We're going through these things step by step and finding those efficiencies and either solving it with tech or just solving it through doing it in a smarter way. So I think that in a similar way, as far as, I'd agree. If you're in a market where, housing is $150 a square foot, then, it's going to be fairly challenging if and I would say that, for our smallest model, because we have to do a kitchen and a bathroom and all of the permitting and everything else, the price per square foot tends to be up a bit. If you look at our 750, then which is the 750 square foot 2-bedroom, then the cost per square foot comes down significantly. But this is really in that similar vein, as far as we'll continue to strip costs out of every step of the way, whether it's transportation, whether it's construction, or whether it's the actual installation of the unit. So we would anticipate.
And you guys are trying to take overall, like you're trying to be a one-stop shop for utility hookup and plumbing and all these zoning, all this stuff. Like the other providers, they're just like, we'll get you the unit, you figure all that out yourself, right? And that's where most of the cost is, all the other stuff, it seems like, right?
Boxabl is, Boxabl, you need your own contractor to do the install.
The way I think about SonderPods is I sort of think like we're at SonderPods 3.0 at the moment. And really 1.0 was doing the my background is in digital marketing. So the initial thing was, well, you know what, I'm just going to put together people that want to build an ADU with people that want to build ADUs, right? And what we found was that with these smaller dwellings, because you have to do all of the annoying things, you have to do the permitting, you have to do the utilities, you have to build kitchens, bathrooms, all of these sorts of things, but you don't have the square footage of the home that would allow you to charge the customer a lot of money to make your margins back, right? And that's generally the way that general contractors work and so forth, as far as because they can charge for open space in the similar way that they would otherwise, then it was difficult for them. So we just found that there were lots of people that wanted to build accessory dwelling units, but there were not that many people that wanted to build them. So we moved to the next model, which is more of the model that you see with Boxabl and so forth around that, where it's just like, you know what, we're going to build a factory. We're going to, build these units out and really, think about it from that perspective, as far as think about it like, what can we do on the construction side of things to squeeze as much of the inefficiency out of the process there. But then what we found was that it became even worse if you measure yourself based on delivered units, like actually getting homes that people can live in on properties. Because what you would have there is that if you were to partner with a general contractor, not only are they not getting the overall house to build, now all you're asking them to do is dig some trenches and some foundations and so forth. And we found it was even harder to do that. So we feel like we've been through that evolution, and we really found the only way to deliver a reliable service that we've found so far is actually to provide a complete end-to-end sort of vertically integrated service for customers, where we can take you from initial concept and feasibility through to actually delivering the unit on site, and we do that all under one umbrella. It would be a hell of a lot easier if we could just ship out the SonderPods at the factory and say, there you go, away you go. We just know that the reality is not that, as far as the permitting, the hooking up utilities, all of these sorts of things. It's a very different game, and I would say the biggest challenge actually lies in those areas, like being able to construct units more efficiently than a general contractor is not that hard. Getting them actually on site, that's when it becomes a lot more of a difficult proposition.
So where does SonderPod stand? You have a concept, you have some nice pictures on a website, you have prototypes, you're in production. Where are you on that path now?
Yeah, so we have about 28 projects underway at the moment in various stages of permitting. We're delivering around about one a month, and we're ramping that up to deliver one a week in 2021. Our production facility allows us to build up to 200 units a year. So therefore, that's where we are at the moment. Obviously, we won't stop at 200. It's a very big market. We estimate that more than 1 million of these will be built in California. Obviously, we need to ramp up production, because 200 is not really going to make much of a dent in that. But we're sort of progressing through that, and as it stands, we can actually build more units than we can deliver at the moment. So therefore, a lot of the focus is around, organizing that whole orchestra of working with the cities, working with the sites, and preparing to do it. Like, assembling a unit in a car park or something along those lines. It's fairly easy to do, but when you're actually dealing with reality of sloped lots and trying to get over other houses and between power lines and these sorts of things, it's a very, very different proposition indeed.
So do you build the whole thing in the factory and then ship the whole thing in one piece out to the site, or do you build it in pieces and assemble the pieces on site?
Yeah, so our current range is typically built in two components. So it's two halves. We've got the mechanical components on one side, and then we have obviously the remainder of the living space and everything on the other side. So they're shipped in two halves. Then from, we typically measure the time from truck to slab, or so the amount of time that it takes when the trucks arrive at the location to the time that the units are secured on the foundations. And that's typically the fastest we've done is 68 minutes, but it's typically around about 90 minutes from the time that the trucks arrive to when the units are sitting on the foundations. And then obviously from there, we need to finish out, connecting up the utilities, any landscaping or finishing, decking, and these sorts of things that a lot of our customers like to add on that.
That's amazing. Is it just you have a crane and the crane lifts it off the truck and moves it to the spot?
Yeah. So we typically one of our crew comes in about 2 weeks before the installation date. They're on site for about 7 days, and what they're doing there is they're preparing what we call roughing. They're roughing in the utilities. They're building in the foundations, getting ready for it. So therefore, rather than us turning your backyard into a construction site for months on end, 4 people show up to your property for 1 week, and they do that initial work. Then we have a 7-day drying time for the concrete to settle and be ready for the installation. Then on installation day, we buy coffee, the neighbors come and watch, and we crane a house over your house and into the back. And that whole process, from the trucks and cranes arriving to leaving, is around about 3 hours. But obviously the actual lifting time and moving it over there is typically, just over an hour. And then the crew remains behind, and depending on how much else you want to do as far as decking and other things like that, we could be out of there as soon as a week after installation, or it might be as much as 2 to 3 weeks.
And what do you find are the biggest cost drivers? Like when you look at why, let's say your unit, forget about the installation part, but the unit, this 430 square foot unit ends up costing $129,000 before the installation. What are some of the big cost drivers in just building the unit itself?
Well, kitchens, bathrooms, these sorts of things, but also, building to, the Title 24 California standards, as far as we are building net zero passive homes. The level of insulation and layers, like each one of the walls, there's actually 6 layers within there, from your drywall to soft insulation, then your sheathing. Then we have another 2.5 inches of rigid insulation around that. Like we joke that it's the cooler box or whichever, kind of solution to it. But, these are highly insulated permanent homes. They're not, mobile or manufactured homes from that perspective. They, so typically, they're built to a higher standard now with all of the Title 24 requirements than pretty much any other home in California. So, I think just generally, it's not sort of one particular thing. I think that if you group everything together, and you're wanting to make sure that these things are created with full kitchens, full bathrooms, and they're actually a home that you can live in. But then on top of that, you layer in the fact that it needs to be net zero and passive. What does that mean, net zero and passive? Well, net zero energy, in other words, if you add solar or whichever, our units are 100% electric. So therefore, the amount of power that it uses, we put solar arrays on the top of the units. So therefore, the unit doesn't use as much power as what it produces. So therefore, it's net zero energy. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can achieve that, right? Either you can just put a whole lot of solar on the roof. So therefore, you're just producing so much power that it doesn't really matter how efficient the unit is. That's one way of achieving net zero. Or the other way of doing it is actually being thoughtful about, okay, well, how much should I spend on the solar and how much should I spend on insulation and so forth and in the design? So therefore, for example, if you have a highly insulated unit, then it's going to be much more effective at keeping heat out or heat in, depending on what you want, which then in turn reduces the overall energy load on the unit. So that's something we've actually spent a lot of time on, is to, start to, figure out that equation on behalf of our customers, to sort of say, okay, well, if you were to make the choice between, having more insulation or just, increasing the power production, then, that's the way that we're sort of balancing those two things out. So therefore, you don't have to buy a huge amount of solar. And at the same time, the home's actually doing a lot of the work for you.
But so the reason I'm asking that question is what we see. You brought up Tesla earlier. What I see is, all right, you're doing one a month now. Your short-term goal is to get to 1 a week, and then eventually 4 a week, because that's what your factory can do. Do you see where economies of scale are going to allow you to lower the cost significantly, and where do you see potentially saving money in terms of economies of scale?
Yeah, so we've already saved about 100 hours per installation on the actual installation side of things, and we've saved that again just through improving process and so forth around about what we're doing. There's other many opportunities that we have, as far as there are areas of transportation and also the cranes, as far as I think that bringing those potentially in-house is a way to get that unit cost right down. So I think that the more that we can vertically integrate those services in-house allows us to be able to pass that on. So around about 15% of the cost at the moment is within those services outside of that. So I think there's some great efficiencies in our ability to go from factory to the site. And then also within the factory, I think that at the moment, what we're doing is that we've made some great gains by using light gauge steel as the basis of construction, which again allows us to eliminate all wastage, but also accelerate the process of going from zero up to having fully structural, all of the framing and everything up ready for the unit. But there's a number of other ways where, with scale, we'll be able to prefab panels. We're actually looking at standardizing particular components of the unit. So therefore, kitchens and bathrooms are the same size, regardless of which unit you're going for and so forth. So we anticipate that, we're probably, halfway through the journey of efficiency. And that's not taking into account any kind of efficiencies that we would get in the supply chain by just ordering more windows and doors or more materials, and obviously the improved unit economics that we would get off the back of that. So yeah, we've made a good start, but there's a long way to go, including, we've already identified quite a few areas where we can improve efficiency with some automation.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that if you were building 200 a year instead of 12 a year, that your negotiations with the suppliers of kitchen equipment and windows and doors might become a little bit better for you. You might have a little bit negotiation. And then, of course, I'm assuming you're not aiming to end at 200 units a year. Your vision would be once you get to 200 units a year, or before you get there, you're already looking at the next factory. What's your vision for where it goes after 200?
Yeah, I think if we get to 200 in the current factory, I've done something wrong, right? I think we would have transitioned a long time before that. We've already identified a number of areas that we would go, but I think to have a clue of where this would go is that I think there is, an automobile is actually a much more complex piece of machinery than what a home is. So therefore, it's not a big leap to actually look at standardized modular components, which we use for housing and various other things to be produced in a production scenario, which is much more similar to an automotive production scheme rather than actual custom built housing. We already do a lot of this where, we've got the 3 different options of the homes at the moment. We'll be adding to that range in early 2022. We're actually going to add some more ability to reconfigure, because obviously one of the things we've learned about dealing with people's backyards is that no 2 backyards are the same. So we've looked at how do we actually create more flexibility around floor plans and footprints. But then on top of that is that we've been very careful to make sure that we're working with standardized components. So therefore, there isn't the path to being able to introduce larger amounts of automation into the process and make it look more like an automotive production line versus manual labor and construction of a unit. We're closer to that than one would think.
Where are you building them now? Where's the factory?
Riverside, California.
So have you thought about building them? Like, would cost of manufacture be less if you went to Nevada or Arizona?
Yes. Well, labor would most likely be less, but we think that there's a huge amount of gain that could be made by reducing the amount of labor that goes into each one of those units. So yeah, I think that, say for example, going from 0 to 200, I think that having proximity to the design teams and the rest of the organization has been a big help to us. But I think that, when we move to that next thing, which is going from 200 to 2000, then that's when the economies of scale, as far as having a larger facility, which is in potentially a lower cost location, would start to become advantageous, especially if we can start to compress the transportation costs.
Okay, and how big do you see? You mentioned going to 2,000, so I guess the next step in your eyes would be a factory that could produce 2,000 a year, which would be, what is that, 40 a week? That would be about.
Yeah. So
how big is the market? How many of these does California? I mean, I would think California has a much bigger market than that.
Well, yeah, it does. I try and I try and remain pragmatic and just sort of focus on the next step from that. But when I sort of dare to look a couple of steps further than that, if we just look at the overall total market opportunity, there's 6.9 million homes in California. According to various different reports, we're 3 million homes short of what we require, and that number increases by 400,000 a year. So the actual high-level numbers are significant. Now, if you look at accessory dwelling units, where if you just think about the backyards where we've got enough space, we've done quite a bit of work around leveraging things like computer vision to actually review satellite imagery to be able to measure people's backyards, which is a view I said earlier about trying to save the cost of needing a $3,000 surveyor. That's a bit of a clue to the way that we'll be looking to solve that issue. We generally, the method that I use, or the math that I use, is that typically our target market are people that live in properties that are worth more than $750,000. We estimate that there's around about 1.5 million homes in California that have that. The logic for that,
it's got to be a lot more than that. My brother lives in like an 1,100 square foot house in a relatively not great neighborhood, and is worth $1 million.
Yes, well, obviously every year the number of those homes increases as property prices go up, right? So we tend to try and take a bit more of a conservative view of it, but we estimate by looking at the number of houses that we believe have got enough space for an accessory dwelling unit, and then we multiply it by the legislation to be able to say, okay, well, how many have got a backyard that's actually big enough to take one of these units? We estimate that there'll be, there's 1.8 million homes in California that could take one of these. So therefore,
well, then why? Well, when you said that the next step was 2,000, I'm thinking you're not thinking big enough. Maybe the next step should be 20,000 or 200,000. What stops you from thinking bigger than that?
Well, it's certainly not the production in the factory. I think that ultimately, we can, increase the production in the factory side of things. I think that in order for one organization to easily, get to 20,000 or 100,000, which I think the marketplace would withstand something like that, I think it requires further automation of the process of permitting, because again, everything gets funneled through, and the numbers that we've been doing so far has also been through a pandemic, and the majority of that time is the cities have been closed. So, I think there's an awful lot that can be done around automation of that legislation. So I think that the number of people that want one of these, want an accessory dwelling unit, and then how quickly we can deliver those, sort of the bottleneck in the middle, although there have been some incredible, developments in this area. And I applaud the changes in the legislation, which there's just another round of legislation that's been passed that makes it even easier. Still, it is a manual process as far as, every single project needs to go through building review, planning review, fire, and everything, which I'm sympathetic to, as far as, like in California, as far as one thing that we need to be very aware of is fire, right? So, there are some things that we shouldn't be shortcutting, but certainly I would say that, as that process becomes more simple, and if we can have the cities embrace more technologies, which, we're tending to see that the cities are very open to that. It is just a complex subject, but I think that more in those areas, that as the legislation continues to develop, then certainly, organizations like SonderPod's doing numbers of well above 2,000, like in the 20,000s or the 100,000s. I certainly, start to think that will become a reality.
So the challenge, it sounds like, is permitting. Let me ask you a question from left field, although maybe you've heard it before. Maybe accessory dwelling units in California isn't the only market you should be looking at. What about, like, I'm into off-grid. Like, why wouldn't these be great for off-grid, and how much lower cost could it potentially be if you were putting them off-grid in places that didn't have such rigid permitting processes?
Yeah, I think that, listen, there are multiple applications, around this. I think there's hospitality. There's, people. There's a massive trend around people buying up what used to be more sort of camping grounds and so forth, and turning them into higher end luxury resorts and so forth. There's a hospitality application. There's emergency housing applications. There's, and again, as you say, like more off-grid, sort of community-based type things, and we do have a number of opportunities that are like that. And I think that they're becoming more common. But I think that really what we're looking at is that this direct to consumer model where, the customers that we talk to and the stories that we're kind of helping create with these stories is, really around the amount of freedom and the impacts that we can have on these people's lives of that. I'll give you an example, or, just sort of the way that we sort of think about it and the mission that we're doing, right? As far as, around about 45% of Californians are cost burdened by housing, which means that over 30% of their income every month just disappears on the basics of housing. The knock-on impact of that means that when you're spending all your money on your housing, you're not putting money into your 401k. So 85% of Californians are not saving enough for retirement, right? Now, at the same time, property values have gone up significantly. So we have a ton of people in California that are equity rich and cash poor, and they're behind when it comes to things like saving for the retirement and other things like that. So what we're finding is that an accessory dwelling unit is one of the best ways, and from a financial perspective, it's almost a no-brainer to leverage that equity and to turn your primary residence, which is normally an investment which is going up on an equity basis, but you don't realize that unless you sell the property and move to a lower cost location. The difference that it makes on your portfolio and how well set up for retirement, if you can bank on your primary property paying you $2,500–3,500 a month, it's a fundamental difference. Like that kind of income is like replacing $500,000 in your 401k.
So people put in an accessory dwelling unit and then they either rent it out or Airbnb it.
Yeah. So not Airbnb, because part of the legislation is that they need to be rented for 30 days or longer. And I know, but Airbnb is encouraging some more longer term stuff at the moment. More of the typical things that we're doing is that there's, something where you've got an aging parent that would normally have to move out of California. Like the number of people that can afford to live in California is a very, very small fraction. So when they retire, they have to move to a lower cost location. It's breaking up families, separating grandchildren and grandparents and so forth. So typically the use case is either adult children that can't afford to get on the property market now and they're paying $5,000 a month for rent. Parents are building an accessory dwelling unit to have their adult children get a start in life. And then once they've been able to save up enough for their property, then it becomes an important part of their retirement strategy. Or at the other end of the life cycle, where aging parents being able to keep grandparents and grandchildren close and so forth, that's another very common use case. But every single time it's always that not only does this serve me and give me freedom to be able to do something incredible for my kids or for my parents, but also on top of that, it allows people to sleep at night because they know that they've got this nest egg, which is setting themselves up for retirement in a good way. Like a customer, the way that they described it to me was that they knew that they were behind on saving for retirement, like most of us, right? And with doing one thing, they were able to get 10 years of savings back. So they were, from being behind, they're now like completely up to date, and the amount of sort of the pressure release that they felt through doing that, because they've got the option. They can, either rent out the ADU for, $2,500 a month, or they can live in the ADU and rent out the primary home for $6,000 a month, right? It just gives you that freedom of choice.
And those ADUs the one I walked in was really nice. I would love to live in that. I would think it was a 750 square foot one maybe, but I went over there and I checked it out and I was like, wow, this is really nice. I mean, it's like a brand new home, like a real legitimate home. Like it was really nice inside. I would prefer living in the ADU and just renting out the primary house.
Well,
I think.
Yeah,
well, it depends what your needs are, right? If you still have kids,
yeah,
you need more space.
Yeah.
So
the unit that Emmet came and saw is that our customers there, the parents actually elected to live in the ADU because they liked it better.
So they let their grown-up kids live in their primary residence. Yeah,
and so they left the primary residence for their adult kids. So therefore, they talk about it as the compound where they've just got this base in Sunnyvale where whatever happens, the family's going to be able to sort of come back to that location and sort of set themselves up. So, it's been really quite cool as far as the way that we're able to create that kind of freedom by unlocking that equity. that the people have got in their homes. And there's obviously millions and millions of people that are in that situation. And there's very few things that I've seen that allow you to do that. Like these things pay themselves off in 8-9 years. And, the level of returns that you're getting from an ADU versus buying a rental property or, doing various other things, it's a pretty compelling financial proposition, as well as, a lifestyle proposition as well.
So Emmett, I've been asking a lot of questions and maybe I'm missing something. Is there something else I should be asking? I have some other stuff I want to talk about. But is there something else I should be asking that I'm missing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one main point, the main takeaway I get from this, Ed, is that the main bottleneck is all the manual, permitting, zoning, utility hookup, that type of process, surveying, those manual kind of processes that go in between the construction and the actual installation. Is that sort of the bottleneck right now?
Yeah, it's an orchestra, right? As far as you need to have the whole thing playing together, and you need to line all those things up. Like being able to deliver something at a price point, at speed, and at scale requires coordination of many more things than just the production of a unit in the factory. As far as I think about the things that we're really focusing on. A lot of the gains come outside of that, as far as so I think that, if we think about the cost of a project as around about 30 to 40% of the project is actually in the installation side of things. So therefore, if you compress the cost of the construction of the unit and you don't do anything about getting that unit onto the property.
And it's a bad customer experience if you don't take it over either. If you leave it to the customer or refer it to some contractor that's kind of outsourced, that's not part of doesn't have a huge incentive. So I think like what I'm getting at here is like all the firms out there trying to do this, but trying not to touch that part. I think there's a lot of risk in those firms. I think like what you're doing is the hard grunt work, like figuring out how to streamline it. That's what needs to be done for this to be a good customer experience too. And the other thing I wanted to touch on that I thought interesting, I don't know if you mentioned, I don't think you mentioned it, is one way to potentially get the pricing down. I think you referenced it to me in the past in a conversation, is that you're thinking about some like higher end options to offer, maybe where people pay for like some premium options for their house that, some people might opt for, but you have much better margins where you can lower the cost for the main unit down over time. Sort of like what car companies do even, right? With high end options, they can help lower the average price. But I think people have to remember you're delivering on the high end stuff right now, like the Model S, and over time, you'll hope to get to the Model 3 and the Model Y and what's below that for other states.
Let me ask that question. What's the Model 3? If you're doing the Model S right now, where, what could you do for people who don't want to spend that much money? How do you deliver something that's significantly less expensive than what you're doing now?
Well, one of the things is modularity is key. So our ability to be able to reuse components within the manufacturing process. So there's a few things there that you wouldn't recognize differently across each unit. Now, also, within California, there's a whole bunch of legislation around net zero and things like that. In other states, we don't have the same legislation to work with. So I think that naturally in lower cost states, which have got less regulation, then that's going to bring down the price anyway, because we have to do less to the unit. But typically the way that we'll be able to further compress and improve the efficiency of the construction of the unit without doing the cheat thing, which is actually just reducing the quality. As far as we want to maintain the same quality, we want to maintain net zero and passive capabilities within the home. There's going to be an element of it is really reusability, as far as the kitchen and bathroom components and so forth will be the same regardless of which unit you're in. And then maybe you can add the components that you want. So therefore increasing flexibility to the customer. So therefore you're paying for the components that you need. Like, do you need 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms? Do you need an office? Do you want a larger living space or a smaller living space? I think the first thing is to make sure that people are not paying for space that they don't need. And allowing them to be able to do that. So from us, you'll see increased sort of reconfigurability of the units. On our side, that will allow us to increase the reusability of our designs and create additional efficiencies there. And then I think that through supply chain and also improving our production processes, which I think there's quite a few things that we can do there. I also think there are just as many gains in our ability in the time from factory to site. So I think that they'll be sort of the main areas. But to speak to Emmett's point, I would say that we deliver sort of the higher to mid range at the moment, as far as every single unit has multi-zone HVAC, it has full-size kitchens, it's got, the finishes are certainly at the higher end, and obviously we would have the ability to reduce down and having lower cost components, and there are cheaper ways of doing that. We just haven't elected to do that. So if we felt the price was the number one thing that we needed to hit, yeah, we'd be able to get the pricing down. We typically find that the customers that we're looking that we work with, they've got a lot invested in their home. They've got a lot of pride in their home, and they don't want to put a shed out the back. They want something which is built to at least the same quality of their primary home, with the same finishes and so forth around it, and something that's going to last. So I would say that the next thing that we'll do is actually we get more questions from customers about going up rather than going down. So we're actually looking at providing the ability for people to actually increase either the intelligence in the unit, so bringing in more smart home options and things like that, or just more sort of higher end options for people to be able to customize the fixtures and finishes and upgrade kitchens and bathrooms and those sorts of things. So the next place you'll see us go is actually further up, but then as a different model, and then sort of from that, we should be able to come back with some lower price point stuff if we see market demand for it.
So what's the investor side of this, Emmet? How, as an investor, you're looking at this business. Is there a cap table? How much has been invested in the business so far? I don't know how much you can talk about this.
Yeah,
I don't know which one of you wants to talk about it. You invested it in Emmet. What was the motivation? Where do you see this going down the road?
Yeah, I've known Ed for a while, and I trust him. And I think when we first started talking about this, Ed, you had left your previous job, or you're doing this on the side, preparing to leave your previous job, and you were really emphatic and interested about it. And I was interested in brainstorming with you. And at first we were talking about I think it was when Oculus first came out or something, and I had gotten it, and I was like, oh, it's so cool. You got to try it. And I was like, you could create a VR shed in people's backyards. They would love it. Just create a little box. People could put their VR set. I think that's the future. And, that was a long time ago, but you've come a long way since then.
Want to do that.
Yeah. You remember that. Yeah. And you've come a long way since then. And I think it was around a couple of years ago when you were getting really serious, and you had sunk a lot of your own savings into it. And you were like, yeah, if you're interested in investing. And I was, and I know your work ethic, and I clearly could tell that demand is not the issue. Your digital marketing skills, that's your skill set. And you had walked me through A to Z, how you can generate leads for, $23 or whatever the price was. You showed me hey, on Facebook, I can create as many leads as I need for $23 on average or whatever it was. And you showed me, walked me through it. And I was like, wow, that's truly, that seems like unlimited demand. I'll help, fund getting you going. And so I was able to invest, for a small percentage out of my IRA account at the time. And then we had a further investment not too long ago out of my IRA account. And so I don't think you have many investors. I think we kept it simple, and maybe me and maybe one other person or something, or you haven't really gone out to raise money. You're not trying to make that a big deal. You're just trying to get self-sustaining. You're already sort of profitable. I mean, tell us about that. What's that? Yeah. What's going on there?
Yeah. So sort of the history that we haven't, we've really been looking at perfecting the model. The way that we've designed it is that it's break even on a cash basis. So therefore, it's the way that we've done it is not particularly capital intensive. In the agreements that we have with our customers, we're typically paid before we need to pay suppliers and so forth. So therefore, it's a very efficient model from that perspective. We spent a lot of time on making sure that we got that right. But we have had a couple of opportunities during the time. One was a strategic investment from a company called KHS&S, who they do several $100 million a year in the commercial space. They build hotels and hospitals and stadiums and these sorts of things. And they've been specialists in prefabricated construction for a number of years, and they expressed a lot of interest in what we were doing. So we were actually able to agree on a really strong partnership, which was them. So we've got this construction and building expertise from a company that's been around for 25 years and does hundreds of millions of dollars of this a year. That's our construction backbone. So there's been a couple of occasions where we've had the opportunity to bring in strategic funds and partnerships, but it's been more around who's going to help us go faster. So we haven't gone out just to raise capital generically so far. And I think that's worked out really, really well for us and has put us in a very good position. So, and then, we're looking at raising a seed round between now and the end of the year, which is going to, allow us to accelerate the growth pretty significantly. But, the thing that I'm really happy about and comfortable about is that, the fact that we're a very cash efficient business at this point. As far as there's not any kind of, massive, needing to reinvent the wheel for us to get from where we are through to 200 units. And then once we get to that kind of level, that starts to open up many other opportunities for us to make that leap from your 200s to your 2000s and so forth from that. So I feel like we've taken a lot of our medicine over the last couple of years to get ourselves in a pretty solid state and build that solid platform. Like, we're delivering units. We understand the process end to end. We understand our demand generation capabilities and so forth. And now I feel like we're in a really good position to be able to launch from there.
Do you have a sense of what the company will be valued at when you do the seed round, or are you not comfortable talking about that yet?
We don't know at this point. So I wouldn't want to guess. As far as I think that at these stages, quite often it's that the investors ultimately pick what the valuation is. We're just sort of there to present our plan and talk about what we're up to. And
I'm not sure I agree with that. Let me ask you about something. So I interviewed Galliano from Boxabl, and I reviewed. They did a crowdfunding round. They did some other funding. I think they've raised a total of $15 million, including $2 million from his father.
What was that valuation, Warren? It was crazy, right? What was it?
Well, when they did the crowdfunding round, they valued the company at $236 million. So they've raised a total of $15 million in capital. The crowdfunding, this is what really struck me. The crowdfunding round contributed $5 million, which is 1/3 of all invested capital. And they got 2% of the company. They invested 33. Like, if you read the prospectus and you thought about it, you're like, wait a minute, I'm investing 1/3 of the capital in the company and I'm getting 1/50th of ownership.
And I don't think they've delivered really any units yet. Maybe a prototype, one or two.
Exactly. They believe they've had they claim they've had 3 prototypes. I believe only 2 have been seen. So, and I think they have an interesting concept, because theirs like folds up and you're able to carry it on one truck and you don't have to have oversized loads, and they have some interesting ideas there, but they're not doing what you're doing. You have to pay a contractor to do the install. There's they claim it's $50,000, but it's really 75. And then when you get done, it's really 100, and basically ends up being close to what you're doing in terms of pricing. And like you said, Emmett, as far as I know, they haven't delivered a unit yet. So I thought that was striking. And I think the question is, if you're going to do a funding, and I'm new at this, right? I think Emmett knows a lot more about this than I do. As long as you have a plan, this is what we're going to do with the money, and this is how we're going to translate that to revenue, then I think you can raise this. There's obviously a lot of money out there. People paid $5 million to get in on Boxabl
at a 200 and something million valuation.
There's a lot of people out there are willing to fund projects that make sense. I think your project makes just as much sense as theirs does, if not more, because how many units have you actually delivered to customers yet? Are you at one yet, or yet? I think you mentioned you had one couple that chose to live in the 750.
We've delivered 10 in 10 different jurisdictions around California. So
you're ahead of Boxabl, is my point. So I think I think what Boxabl's up to is obviously interesting. It's a different thing where I think that we're sort of going a little bit more, I guess, pragmatically about it, or something as far as looking at the entire solution end to end. We're very clear that construction in the factory, yes, there's a lot of gains to be made there, but it's only one small component of it. And if anything, as I think about it, it's actually one of the easier pieces. Things like, shipping and making sure that you can ship it without pilot vehicles and stuff like that, that's really table stakes for this game. As far as all of our units, like as far as there are requirements all over everywhere
which basically it's very obvious information, which is like you've got maximum height and maximum widths, and the components that we ship around meet those requirements as well. And then also the 45 minutes or whatever it is for if you're unfolding something in a car park or something like that, that's if we looked at an equivalent as far as bringing together the two sides of a SonderPod, as far as it'd be kind of a fun race between the two at some point. But I don't think there are any advantages around there. So really, the price point is going to be the key thing but then also I think the building codes. I haven't seen a huge amount of specific information about exactly which codes the Boxabl unit is being built for. I haven't seen anything regarding the Title 24 requirements. So I think that there's, certainly when I think about it from a California perspective, interesting, and I applaud anyone that's doing, modular housing and compressing the cost of housing and so forth around that. But I think there are, for people that are more educated about the space and so forth, there's more questions than answers at this point.
So let me ask you really quick, just a practical thing. You're in California. I lived in California. It's got to be earthquake safe. What do you do to make sure it's earthquake safe?
Well, that's why we have engineers, and that's part of the city requirement. So each one of the units, so we're certified by HCD, which is the Department of Housing and Community Development in California. So we're an officially certified modular home manufacturer, which means that when the unit leaves our factory, it's already certified for anywhere in California up to 3,000 feet above sea level. The only reason why it's 3,000 feet above sea level is because there was some additional engineering required that we decided that we weren't going to do that at this point because of snow loads and so forth. But we know that any one of our units is seismically rated for any location in California as it leaves the factory. The other component to it is the foundation. So therefore, and again, this is where this game is not just about building the units, it's about thinking about the entire solution. But most of the seismic requirements come in the foundations being used. So therefore, on every single location that we're delivering a unit, that we're looking at soil types and we're selecting the right engineered foundation based on the seismic requirements for that particular lot. So there's all sorts of things you need to consider as far as you need to consider seismic, you need to consider flood zones, what you call WUIs, which are wildlife urban interfaces, which is a lot of that is around fire rating and so forth, which is an important topic in California. So, there are many things that we need to work through. And that's one of the things that's integral to our design, is that we've looked at making sure that our units can fit standard into any one of these locations. My recollection is that earthquakes, you can test structures on something called a shake table. Mm-hmm.
Has that been done with your units?
Well, it's been done. Have we put a SonderPod on a shake table? I'd love to do that, but no, we haven't done that. But that'd be really cool. But obviously, through all of the construction materials and everything around it, is that the engineers, when they're engineering the whole thing, you got to remember that a SonderPod, the construction of it is in light gauge steel, and we need to be able to pick these things up and move them around and whichever. So seismically, I forget the exact ratings from there, but typically, one of the quotes from the engineers that we were talking to is that when there's an earthquake, go and run into your SonderPod rather than stay in your main home. So from a seismic rating and so forth, as far as, these are not lightweight things. These are, heavily structurally engineered units that can withstand kind of any sort of situation, whether they're up on stilts or whether they're on the ground or whether they're, on soft soil, hard soil. That's one of the safe things about modular construction and the way we do it, because we have to engineer for the worst case scenario. So therefore, 90% of the time, you're not worst case scenario. So actually, the units are probably more so over-engineered for your particular location than anything else. And so I think there's safety in that.
You mentioned using light gauge steel. What does that mean? Is that like 22 gauge steel? How do you measure light gauge? What does that mean? Oh,
so light gauge steel, as far as if you imagine, the structure of the units, that when a SonderPod actually starts as, in a coil of flat rolled steel, and then it goes through a cold form printing press where it actually presses out the individual components that's required. So there's actually a CAD file that goes into this unit, and then every single component is laser cut or laser measured to exactly the size and component that it has. So therefore, the entire structure of the unit, has laser level accuracy. So therefore, it fits together perfectly. So it allows us to increase the accuracy. So therefore, everything else fits very well, which means that there's less, for lack of a better word, artistry when it comes to construction. As far as with carpentry and so forth, you're moving with something working with something that's always moving and settling. With steel, it just removes all of that, so we're able to get a much more consistent finish. And then the other thing as well is that it just removes waste, as far as we're only printing exactly what we need. So therefore, from an efficiency perspective and the use of materials perspective, and then also the assembly, that's one of the big time savers. And then also from a quality perspective, we got some really significant gains when we started to look at using light gauge steel over timber. And the other good thing about light gauge steel is that termites don't eat it. It doesn't rot, doesn't burn. So there's just that was something when we really looked at it. I get that it's not the norm, but it was, again, I put that in the no-brainer camp as far as just a better material to use.
Now, really quick, it doesn't seem like something you'd be worried about in California, but I live in Florida. Is there any kind of wind rating that's been done? Because what I notice is you have what I would call a gable roof rather than a hip roof. Mm-hmm. And hip roofs are supposedly better for high winds. Do you have any sense of a wind rating?
Well, it's wind rated for anywhere in California, right? So that's where our level of expertise is there. But obviously, if we're thinking about Florida and other things, the understanding of it is the construction of the roof to the unit, and then the unit to the ground, and you need to solve those two things. Each one of our units are already bolted to the foundations. A lot of houses, believe it or not, just sit on foundations. So therefore, if you get enough wind, it lifts off. As a standard, our units are actually affixed to the ground and bolted down. So we feel like we're in a fairly good space there. And then we actually have a pretty cool solution to give more options around the roof line, which you'll see us come up with in early 2022. But really, the way that we're going with this is, I think, you could go in a couple of different directions with building an ADU. One is that you could have something that fits very nicely with your existing dwelling. So whether you've got a Mediterranean style home, whether you've got a ranch style, whether you've got farmhouse, if you've got a nice Mediterranean look home or a ranch style home, do you want a spaceship in the back, or do you want something that fits together and completes the property? And that's really the direction that we're going, is that even though we're using this advanced technology and these new capabilities of being able to do it, how do we deliver a solution that looks like it should be there and actually completes the overall look of the property, which we believe, therefore, will maximize resale value and will make economic sense as well. So through doing that, we're looking at how do we deliver different roof lines and various other things, which I think we've got some really exciting things that we should be coming out with, I would say, early 2022.
And this is construction nerd stuff, but is it built on is the foundation like a poured slab? Do you have footings that are deeper on one side, or how do you do that?
It depends on the scenario. So we have three sort of standardized foundations that we use. We have a paired foundation, which obviously allows us to go on steep hillsides and so forth around that. The depth that the pier goes in is based on the rating of the soil and various other things. We have another spread footing foundation that we use, and then the other foundation that we use is a perimeter foundation. So really, the cities have got different jurisdictions about which foundation to use. We've sort of standardized each one of these foundations with tolerances, so therefore we know that our spread footing from one side of the unit to the other side of the unit.
What is spread footing?
Spread footing, if you imagine, I'm trying to think of a good example, but I'll use this one in the absence of a good one. But if you imagine a duck's foot, how it's all spread out, so therefore they don't sink in the mud, it's a similar thing. So therefore it's a foundation pier, but it spreads out around about a yard in either direction on the ground. So therefore it sits, you don't need to dig in deep. So it really benefits from the width and also the weight, because these are concrete. So that's a spread footing, which is most appropriate in certain soil circumstances. And then you have other soil circumstances where, especially if you're on a hillside, or if you're, if it's more of a sandy composition of the ground, then you need to go deeper. And that's when we use a pier. And then often when you're in the high fire risk areas, then you start to use a perimeter foundation. So there's really nowhere that fire can get in underneath underneath the unit and so forth. So that's, again, one of those areas where it's about the understanding, the experience about each location that you're going into to make sure that you're getting the right solution, which, it's what we're finding is a lot like this conversation. So much of the the magic formula for doing this is actually after you leave the factory, and thinking about each one of those components. And I'm not underselling what can be done around that, but I just think it's an oversimplification to think that this is purely just a manufacturing problem that we're solving here.
Right. So I have something else I want to talk about, but Emmett, is there anything else you want to ask or talk about with the ADUs before I move on?
One quick question for you, Ed. Like, I know you have a little bit of a backlog. You don't want your backlog to get too big, so you haven't tried to generate too many leads probably. But if I was like really interested and I was like, I want to buy one right as soon as possible, what's like the timeline? If I placed my order and told you guys I'm ready to go, like how soon would I get it? Would it be like 3 months, 6 months, 1 month? What's the timeline?
Depends on what city you're in. Some cities are like, permitting's taking around about 3 months, and others are taking like a month. So
I see.
So if we take the permitting out of the equation, then if you said, hey, and I'm really interested, what we would do is do a feasibility of your property. So we would take a look at that. It takes us about a week to complete that work. We would come back with a full estimation for you, which gives you, before you get too far into it, what your project's going to cost. If you're okay with that, it takes about a week to submit everything into permits. So say we're 2 weeks in now. Then we say that, so 2 weeks in, we're mid-October, right? Now, say the city takes a month to approve those permits, then we're mid-November. At that point, we start the construction. So that takes about 30 days. So therefore, 2 weeks before construction, our team will turn up to the location, do the foundation and everything else around that. So if we're saying that we begin construction mid-November, then delivery would be sometime mid-December. You're probably having a New Year's party in your SonderPod. So that's kind of, but again, obviously, if the permit process takes 3 months rather than 1, then it just increases by that permit time. Sure. But the key thing is it takes us 30 days to manufacture the unit. Installation starts 2 weeks into that construction or 2 weeks before, whichever way you want to look at it.
Yeah.
So, once that unit, once the permit's issued, then it's, it really starts to take off and things start to happen quick.
Neat. All right. Yeah, that's it, Warren. Just wanted to find out about that.
So I want to move on to my wacky idea.
Yeah.
You're doing something radically different from what I want to do. And maybe what I'm doing is foolish, but I will roughly say my idea is solar farm housing off grid. It doesn't have to be off grid, but the basic idea is that, and it's apartment housing. Like what you're doing is you're selling something to people who already own a home to increase their equity in their property and give them additional housing on their property. What I have in mind is there's a lot of people who can't afford to own a home and they find renting homes very expensive. And I want to say, can I make something that's really inexpensive to rent? And part of that is I got to make it inexpensive to build, and I've got to do other things to make it inexpensive. So the basic idea, this is a massive oversimplification, but you see the triangle on here. So there's a triangle here. It's a 30, 60, 90 triangle, and it's 40 feet deep, and the roof is about 46 feet long because it's a triangle, and the high end is about 24 feet. And basically you have an 18 kilowatt solar panel roof on top of this space. And then you end up with about 500 or so square feet or 550 square feet of usable space on the ground floor and a loft space in the upper part of the one side of the unit. So you end up with about an 800 square foot apartment that's producing, that has an 18 kilowatt solar roof on it, which I live in a 3,200 square foot house. When Tesla was looking at my house, they came up with like a 12 kilowatt system. So this is more electricity produced for an 800 square foot apartment than would be produced for a 3,200 square foot house. I think you would be able to produce excess electricity beyond that. That's the basic idea.
Yeah.
And one of the big ideas, like whenever you're going to do, and the idea would be you'd build a row of them, right? So instead of just building one unit, they're about 20, 21 feet wide. Instead of just building one, you build 5 or you build 10. And that lowers your construction cost per unit because you're sharing that construction over multiple units.
Yeah.
And then one of the challenges you get in a lot of places, like this is a problem probably in California and Florida, most places, is zoning makes it difficult to do this. If you want to do multiple residents, in Florida at least, it's really hard to find those properties. When you can find them, they're really expensive. Typically the zoning was done where they zoned the properties as multiple residents when there were already multiple residences on them. And then everything else is zoned single family. So it's really hard to find property where you can build multiple residents. Texas, which is where I'm looking, there's not a lot of zoning in Texas. So I'm thinking about doing it in Texas. And then one of the big challenges you face also is disposing of solid waste, which is not an issue for what you're doing because you're tapping into the sewer system of the existing house, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So I'm thinking off grid, or one of the big ideas I stumbled on, and this was because I was looking at RVs and I was looking at off grid cabins generally, was what if we used incinerator toilets? And now we no longer need to do the plumbing for the toilet. We don't need water into the toilet. We don't need to get rid of the poop. We don't need to get rid of that. We don't need to have sewage treatment for the what's it's called black water when you're dealing with RVs.
Yep.
You got black water and gray water. You still have, when you take a shower, that water, when you're using your kitchen sink, that water, you need to do something with that. That needs to be disposed of properly. But that's a much easier problem to manage than managing what's coming out of the toilet. So I'm just sort of putting this whole idea together. And my vision of this is I'm not going for the same. I think you're going for sort of luxury. Your customers are looking for luxury, right? They want this to be nice. They own $1 million home. They don't want to put a junk shed in the backyard. I'm thinking this is for people who are tired of paying $1,500 a month of rent. And they're thinking, wait, you could do something for me for $800 a month and it's decent, but not luxurious. And I'm working 12 hours a day. I just want a place I can go sleep and hang out a little bit. And I can play my video games and move on. You know, the target audience for what I'm doing is younger, maybe.
Yeah.
So my question for you is, when I have this design in my head, I haven't gone far enough to think, how much is it going to cost me to build that? And when you describe the challenges of building what you're building before you even get to installation, it seems like there's a lot of cost in there that I don't see. And I think part of it, like you said, is this Title 24. You have to build it net zero. And I'm thinking you can build a steel building really cheap if you're not worried about insulation, right? If you're not worried about having fancy doors and windows. Are
you not going to be worried about insulation in Texas? Like we've all been in Texas in summer, right?
Well, if you have an 18 kilowatt solar panel roof, you would have some insulation, but you don't need to have it as well done as you're doing it. If you've got excess electricity produced, then you just use your air conditioner more, or you use your heater more. You're not generally going to need to heat very much in Texas. You're going to need to cool. Depends where you are in Texas. Texas, for those who don't know, Texas is big. I just drove across it. And not only did I drive across it, I was also in the southern tip. I drove across from El Paso to Louisiana. And at the same time before that, I flew down to the southern tip of Texas. So northern part of Texas is colder than the southern part of Texas. But for most of where I'm thinking in Texas, it's going to be primarily a cooling problem. And of course, you'd want some insulation. But if you have low cost electricity, it may be cheaper to just use the solar on the roof to run the air conditioner to cool the place, rather than spend, because this is the problem that I see. The challenge of building a well-insulated property may end up being a lot of cost. Or am I wrong about that? It really doesn't cost that much if you do it right.
Yeah, typically, I think what you would find is that there's an 80-20 rule when it comes to insulation, right? And I think that to a certain extent, the payback that you get from doing a relatively good job with the insulation actually exceeds the benefit that you would have by, it depends on, what you've paid for the solar and how much solar you're producing and so forth around that. But I don't think there would ever be a situation where having minimal insulation would actually financially work out. I think that, when we looked at solving this problem, we were ultimately looking at the same thing where, you can, yes, put more solar panels on and put more AC in there. But I think there's a couple of things which, when you get into the reality of things, that AC units break down. So therefore, you've got to sort of take that into account, where if you're just solely reliant on that, that's like a single point of failure that you probably want to have less of a risk on. But then also just economically, often doing the right thing environmentally or is also the right thing financially in many occasions. So I think that what you would probably find is that if you put some additional thought into that and maybe encasing the unit in some rigid insulation or something like that to make sure there's no thermal breaks or anything in the unit, which we do on the SonderPod side of things, I think the bang for buck that you would get versus the additional amounts of either solar or HVAC or whichever you would create, that would probably work out. But I think, one of the areas that I would love to see further development and also for the cities to further embrace is some of the solutions that you talked about around dealing with waste. As we think about it from an engineering perspective, the production of electricity around California and maybe places like Texas and so forth, as far as you've just got this big band-aid that you can stick over it called solar, right? It can solve all manner of problems. But the fully approved and endorsed solutions around waste management are few and far between. So whether you're looking at composting or incineration of solid waste and so forth, the city legislation around that, as far as it's actually pretty restrictive. Although, typically it could well be a much better solution. I think the governance and use of grey water and black water and so forth, there's some huge benefits that we could have, especially in California, where it's a drought-ridden state, right? As far as more effective use of grey and black water solutions. Again, I think that a lot of those solutions are in their infancy and are not really they're not scale ready, but certainly something that I'm very interested in. And then the other thing, the cost of storage of electricity as well is still too high from what we've seen. So obviously, we've got beautiful solutions like Tesla Powerwalls and things like that. But, when you actually think about the overall cost, is that it in a lot of situations, they can tend to be cost prohibitive. So, like just to go in the crazy direction, I'm trying to recall what this material is called, but it's a really interesting material where chemically
the SIF, I think it's called.
Oh no, I'm going much further down the cave on this one. But so there's a material that when it's dry, it just sits at room temperature, and then when it's exposed to water, it heats up. And it's totally reusable. So therefore, theoretically, you could use solar to, you have these big banks of these things. And if you think about storage, then, you could dry these, these fuel cells out, which is just made of this sort of limey, chalky component. I'll have to look up and see what these are called. But you use solar to dry them out. And then throughout the winter, you pour water onto it and it generates heat. And then when you have solar, then you can dry them out again, and it's a perfectly reusable kind of circular thing. So I think there are so many different ways that if someone can come up with some better solutions around waste management and energy storage in ways that like I think I'm assuming that if we could get Powerwalls cheaper, then we would. But those are sort of the two areas there. So I'd say that of your overall plan, which I love. I think that the areas that will require more focus and thought is waste management. I think that everything else kind of, it's actually a fairly straightforward equation of just figuring out how much insulation you'd want versus the energy production.
Yeah.
But I think the big thing is going to be waste. And then that actually trickles into zoning, right? So therefore, why are the zones the way they are? It's typically one of the reasons, and one of the many reasons outside of town planning and things like that, is actually the capacity of the public works and so forth to be able to support them. So, I think that is one area where, we even see it in California, where it's, the capacities of the public works and so forth do actually become, an issue that needs to be considered.
Yeah. I mean, actually, part of the idea is the solar roof would also be, you're gonna have a lot of water coming down that just goes down to the bottom of the roof, and you just funnel that water in, and you're storing water. And then, so that should help. Of course, it doesn't rain a lot, then, you're using groundwater, but no. And I think the idea, I mean, ultimately I have this vision that you have 1,000 unit development and you have an 18 megawatt solar plant. that goes along with it, and that's valuable.
Yeah.
One thought I thought Emmet would appreciate is one of the ideas in my head was you have this triangle shape. It's an Elon Musk thing. The best wall is no wall. You dropped one wall.
Yeah, there you go. Best wall is no wall.
The best wall is no wall. Let's
Yeah.
reduce. We eliminate a wall. We save something. And I actually wanted to ask you about this. So what you guys are doing is I think you manufacture these things in 2 pieces where each piece can fit on a truck without being oversized load, right? And then you bring them to the site. So the vision I had was a step less than that, where you build each wall independently or even sections of wall, and you bring them out, and you have some more assembly on site than what you're doing. Boxabl is building the whole thing in one piece and unfolding it. You're bringing it in 2 pieces. I think that's a very common thing with modular homes is you build almost the entire thing. And my vision is sort of, all right, we'll build this wall as 1 or 2 pieces. We'll build this wall as 3 or 4 pieces. We'll build the roof in a few pieces. And it shouldn't be that hard to put it together on site if you do it right. Or I think what you would tell me is, well, Warren, it's a lot easier to do it all in the factory.
Yes, certainly it is. If you've got good access to the property and so forth around that, just being able to do it in the factory and then crane it into the location. Because obviously if you're doing panels and so forth, you're then, after you've got the panels up, then you're putting in the kitchen, the bathroom and everything else. And it's just like all of a sudden, 60, 70% of the construction is actually happening on site rather than in a factory. So,
right.
But certainly for locations that have got access issues, so therefore, one of the things that's somewhat of a kryptonite to modular construction is, high power lines, where you can't come within 30 feet of them and so forth. So sometimes when you've got access issues and you can't do that, then a panelized solution, it's called panelized construction is ultimately what it is, and it's actually quite common in Europe. There are quite a few companies that do that, but given appropriate access, and then also the legislation and the certifications that we need to adhere to, where our units ultimately need to be completely constructed in the factory to be certified under the program that we build under before it gets shipped to site. So obviously, the more that you do on site, there's more local inspections and so forth that have to go along with that. So again, if you look at the entire, if you think the problem ends not at the point when it leaves the factory, but when someone can move in, then actually, we've found that shipping in 2 halves to be able to make sure that the unit is fully certified, doesn't require any local inspections, so forth, then that is the fastest, most efficient way to do it. And then the other thing is that fewer pieces is generally better.
Right.
So therefore, if you've got seams that come together on site and more of those sort of components, then, when you think about it from a thermodynamic perspective, as far as like any sort of seams, you're going to lose thermo efficiency. And then also, things like water and erosion and these sorts of things like that. Anywhere there is a seam, if you're thinking about something that you're building that should last 50 years, any kind of seam is something that you want to eliminate as much as possible. So that's one of the reasons why we feel that, having fewer connection points and this variability as far as if things hinge, if things, sort of go together in a simple way, then you've got to start to ask about, okay, well, how weatherproof is that going to be over a 10, 15, 20-year period? So, we feel pretty strongly that minimizing the, those single points of failure is something that's really important. And if we build out of 9 panels rather than 2, we've got a large number of additional things that could be an issue.
Yeah, I mean, the place where I was thinking of building my prototype is you would not be able to get a 40-foot trailer, tractor trailer with a 40-foot trailer. You would not be able to get it there. Emmet probably knows I bought a Model 3 from Omar Kazi, and I can get to this property with my Volkswagen Passat, but it turns out that going there with my Model 3 is not a good idea. Maybe if I had an all-wheel drive Model 3, it would have been better, but I have a rear-wheel drive Model 3, and I got stuck. I got lightly stuck twice, and my brother pushed me out.
Oh my gosh.
So, and it's like, there's 2 ways in. One way is you're on a main road, you turn on a crappy dirt road, then you turn left on a much crappier dirt road, then you have to turn right through a sand pit to get to the last dirt road to get to the property. The other way in is like tight dirt road with like foliage on either side, and then you have to make a hard right turn and ford a creek, and then go on that last dirt road. And it's like, I don't know if I can get a concrete truck there, right? I think I can get, I talked to the concrete guys. I think they have like 6-wheel drive concrete trucks or something. So that's doable. So I think, well, but I am now, pardon?
Yeah, we had a project in California that we're looking at. Unfortunately, it didn't end up going ahead, but we had actually looked at using a sky crane to bring these things in. So if you can't get a 40-foot truck in there, maybe we'll fly it in for you.
Right. So, and now I think the other problem with doing the modular that you're doing is the size of the building I'm planning on doing. I don't, it would be 46 feet or 40 feet deep. Mm-hmm. And then if you have multiple units, it might be 80 or 100 feet long. I don't know that it would be conceivable, because I think you're probably 8 or 9 feet wide at maximum on your halves.
Maximum shipping width is 14 feet. So we are under that a little bit at the moment. Each one of our units, the maximum width we go to is just under 10 feet at the moment, but there is a bit of give there about how much larger you can go.
Well, I'm looking at, it says 14 feet by 31 feet, and I think the larger one is 19 feet. So wouldn't half of that be 7 or 10?
Yeah, that's right. So as it currently is, but the actual restrictions for shipping is that you can go up to 14.
Okay. So like if my dimensions are 40 feet deep by, 100 feet long, that's not going to work. I'm going to have to have a bunch of sections anyway.
Yeah, if you've got a 30-degree roof, at what point do you cut it off and say that's not livable space, right? Because you won't need livable space right down to a foot.
Right. The very beginning is like pipes and wiring.
Yeah.
And then once you get to, let's say, 4 feet high to 8 feet high, that's a closet. Yeah. And then once you hit 8 feet high, then you've got normal living space. That's the vision. And that leaves you with.
I'm guessing you've probably got about 30 feet left or something like that. So you could again.
It's a little less than 30. It's a little less than 30. It's something by 21. So it's probably like 28 by 21 or something like that.
2 times 14, right?
Yeah. It works out. Anyway, so do you have any questions? Emmet, I brought up this solar farm housing idea. I love getting feedback on it. You heard the best wall is no wall. I've got some other ideas related to that, but what do you think about this crazy idea? Am I nuts for it? And the simple idea is I'm going to buy some land. I already have some land. Maybe I build a prototype there. I was going to build a cabin anyway.
Yeah.
So I build my prototype there instead of building a cabin. I might buy some land. I might buy some land in Austin instead and build it there instead. But what do you think about this idea? Am I crazy? I mean, of course I'm crazy, but how crazy?
You're pushing the envelope. I like this idea better than the 3-wheel or the small tiny electric car
I'm starting to like it better than the small car too.
Yeah, no, I think this idea is much more realistic and could actually happen. Yeah. You should definitely consider it.
Just to be clear, they're both happening, but
okay.
I'm not giving up on single passenger vehicle yet. Prototype is coming in about 6 months.
Okay. Well, this idea I think is something that you could actually build and you would find functional and live in, and like other people might start buying it, or you could figure out ways to have people build it more in a massive way.
So the vision is that, let's say you build 10 units and you're charging $800 a month in rent. Well, you've got 10 units, you got $8,000 a month in rent coming in.
Yeah. And
then, there's some point at which it pays back the cost of construction. It's about $100,000 a year. So if you can build them inexpensively, I think, I sort of have a model in my mind of, and by the way, the solar farm doesn't generate that much money. When you sell the electricity back to the grid, you're not making that much money. Maybe if you're using a mega pack and you sell it back to the grid when there's peak demand, maybe but it just ends up not being that much money. So then the question, here's an interesting question for you. And either of you has an answer to this. I don't know if either of you have an answer to this. If you're generating excess electricity that's more than you could use, what do you do with it? Let's suppose you're not going to sell it to the grid. And I had some ideas like, well, you could use the Sabatier process to generate methane and liquid oxygen for Starship, or you could
mine cryptocurrency with it.
Or you could mine crypto. That was one of the ideas. The other idea was you're running a robotaxi fleet from the property and you're charging your robotaxis with the excess electricity. And my brother had this idea that you chill a metal plate and you condense water from the air and you generate fresh water. So,
interesting.
I don't know whether any of that makes sense, but it's sort of like, it'd be nice to have the problem of what do I do with the excess electricity, right?
And you won't have a problem with the internet. You just get the Starlink thing put out there. You're good.
That definitely the idea was we're going to go Starlink to supply internet to the apartments. And, everybody gets, you have one Starlink for every 4 or 5 units or something like that, maybe every 10, depending on how you set it up.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for
I think
listening
I've
to my
got
insanity. Sorry.
One other thought on the, just a question for you is that if you need a 6-wheel drive concrete mixer to get to the site, where is it and what are they going to do when they get there? Because there's one thing that we've certainly seen from our customers, and that is the impact of the pandemic on remote working. So therefore the ability for, I do think the thing that makes it less crazy is how readily accepted remote working is now and working from home. So therefore, if there was not only a living situation, but also a slick working hub or business hub or something like that. Emmet, you've already mentioned Starlink as far as this could be highly well connected, well powered, and so forth. As far as that starts to push it in the less crazy direction, right? As far as when you start to think about that.
No, Starlink is definitely part of the idea. And then the answer to your question is the idea in Texas is to build it within a not too crazy distance from a big city like Austin. And we're actually looking at land now outside of Austin. And then maybe it's a 30-minute or 40-minute drive to Austin. And then, like I said, we run robotaxi fleet. We incorporate robotaxis into the development, and part of your rent includes, you get free electricity, obviously, you get free Starlink, and you get free robotaxi rides into, we have like robo minibuses taking you into big places, and we have my crazy single passenger vehicle taking you, and maybe there's some charge for using the robotaxis, or maybe it's included. But that, if you live in a world of robotaxis, and I'm not going to have a 100-unit development ready to go for a few years. And I think if the robotaxi world is upon us in 5 years, my timing might be good, that you could still get into places if you need to. I think it's more intended for people who are working on site. I think the world you're talking about with all the remote work, I live in one of the free states, and Texas is one of the free states. We drove across the country from California, and as soon as we crossed the California border, I told the people from the West Coast, welcome to the free states. And seriously, like by the time we reached Texas, we had already crossed Arizona, New Mexico, and they're like, wait, something's different. Like life is very different in the free states.
Yeah.
And if you're in the West Coast, or you're in New York City or whatever, there's places where you don't realize what life is like in the free states. And I encourage anyone, please visit the free states, come and see what life is like in places that aren't quite so dystopian. I hope that doesn't offend either of you, but
no, it's interesting that you.
I think you said you're in New Zealand, right?
Yeah.
New Zealand might be more dystopian
right now, yeah. But I think I was thinking less about the direct impacts of the pandemic and any lockdowns or requirements or any of those sorts of scenarios. It's just one of the things that is true, that remote working was an increasing trend before the pandemic, and the pandemic has done nothing but accelerate that. Like, it's sort of something that would have happened anyway. So I think, we see it from a demand perspective from our side is that, I really see the role of the American home as changing. So, where the American home was somewhere that you live and you pay off the mortgage and raise the kids and then maybe you downsize in the future, the American home is changing, where it's now, we kind of think of this as live, work, and earn, where basically it becomes a place that you live. And it's also a place that you work, and it's somewhere that earns you an income as well.
Yeah.
So, I think that when, and that is an increasing trend, like, so I think more and more so that people are going to be attracted towards, whether they've got gig economy jobs or whether they've got remote working jobs or whichever. I don't really see it as a pandemic thing, whether or not it's people's freedoms being taken away. It's actually an increase of people's freedoms where they're like, you know what, I don't want to go into the office. I don't want to commute for 2 hours. Right. Which, California commute times have now exceeded an average of 2 hours a day. Some people just want their time back.
Right. Okay. So I appreciate your feedback on the idea. I think you've actually, I'm sorry to say, you've made me more excited about an idea that I probably shouldn't pursue, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Warren, you should think about doing it right outside, help provide a place for all the Starbase, people that are going to be working there soon.
The problem with Starbase is the land is really low lying, and I think it's prone to flooding.
Mm.
In fact, I think Jessica Kirsch was in an RV park and her RV park flooded.
Oh,
So
wow.
finding with Austin, Texas area, there's hilly land. There's land that's unlikely to flood. When you're
Okay.
close to the Gulf Coast, you've got hurricanes, you've got, going further inland is better. I did think
Yeah.
about it for Starbase, and the land is cheaper near Starbase, but I think
Yeah.
there would be challenges in doing that. The design I have in mind is not really good for floods.
Yeah. Because you and I know that in like 5 years, in a few years, there's going to be, 10 times as many people employed at Starbase than there are now, and they're going to need places to live.
I actually think Canaveral is a great area to do it. And I was thinking about doing it near Canaveral because I think Canaveral may end up being a larger spaceport than Starbase, Texas. And the problem there is, like I said before, the zoning that I was looking at properties around Starbase, around Canaveral, and I'm talking about really broad scope around Canaveral, and there just isn't really any good land.
Yeah.
That is zoned because of the zoning restrictions in Florida. It's hard to find. Where Texas, once you get Austin itself has a lot of zoning. And Travis County, which is the county Austin, it is more difficult. But once you get outside Travis County, all of a sudden it's much looser. It's a lot easier to do things. You still have to make sure you're taking care of your Blackwater. You still have to take care of certain other resources, but it becomes a lot easier if you do that. So I think I can find 5 or 10 acres, half an hour outside of Austin and make something happen. And if you haven't been to Austin, visit Austin. I've just been there twice. It's fantastic. It's a fun town.
I need to get out there.
I love Austin.
And you need to go to Starbase. You absolutely.
Yeah, that's on my list. Yeah.
Go for a few days, go back every day. It's a blast. All right. Yeah. So thank you, gentlemen, very much. I really appreciate this conversation. I hope you enjoyed that. Please check out my other videos. Please support this channel on Patreon. Thank you so much to the Vasa Law Firm in Sweden, all my Patreon supporters, for helping this channel grow. If you're interested in potentially investing in the future in my startup ideas, it won't be for a couple of years, but there's a link to my investor email list in the description below. And thank you so much for watching.